All right, we'll go ahead and get started. I'd like to thank everybody for coming to this afternoon special edition of the NDSU Extension Agricultural Market Situation Outlook webinar. Today we're going to be talking about trade tariffs in North Dakota agriculture. My name is Dave Ripplinger, economics specialist with NDSU Extension and the regular host of the program. Our webinar is a regular program of NDSU Extension that targets farmers, ranchers, agribusiness leaders, and others who want to know more about current and expected market conditions and their impact on North Dakota's economy. This special edition will include coverage of the current trade situation, including the recently announced reciprocal tariffs announced on Wednesday, responses by trading partners, immediate implications, and what to watch for. NDSU Extension empowers North Dakotans to improve their lives and communities through science-based education. You'll find us at work in your county, at research extension centers across the state, and at the main campus of North Dakota State University in Fargo. Today's webinar is being recorded and will be archived on the NDSU Extension YouTube channel and webinar series. I would like to welcome all of our first-time attendees, cover a little bit of the logistics in just 1 second. Today we're going to have presentations for Matt Gammons, Byron Parman, Frayne Olson, Tim Petry, myself. Everyone will be muted during the webinar, but you're encouraged to send us questions using either the Q&A feature or the chat function. We'll answer those questions at the end of the last presentation. If you need any technical assistance, feel free to reach out to me using the chat. To kick things off, I'd like to begin by welcoming Matt Gammons, who recently joined our department as an assistant professor of agricultural policy. Before beginning your remarks, Matt, could you please introduce yourself? Thanks.
Great, thanks, Dave. Yeah, my name's Matt Gammons. So I've been here at the department about a month and a half. Very new, but very, very excited to be here. So I'm an assistant professor of agricultural policy. In my role at NDSU, I'll also serve as assistant director for the Center for Agricultural Policy and Trade Studies. Just a bit about me. So my hometown is Grand Rapids, Michigan. I did my undergraduate in engineering, actually, at Michigan State University. Wasn't the best at that, decided to switch to economics, and I was out in California for 6 years getting my PhD in agricultural economics. Really started kind of more focused on production issues, but obviously, production and policy are really tightly interlinked, and kind of have gotten more and more interested in policy work since then. So yeah, really excited to be here, and today I'm going to be talking a bit about the proposed port fees. So every word here is important. So proposed, these haven't happened yet. Port, this is relating to, especially when we think about our agricultural export market, and these are fees that would be paid by vessel operators. So just a bit of the timeline on this. So March 12th of last year, so this is more than a year ago, under the Biden administration, 5 national labor unions filed a Section 301 petition, essentially requesting the administration to look into potential kind of maritime practices that were kind of anti-competitive or problematic to American commerce. So that was kind of the initial request was made then. And then on April 17th, the U.S. Trade Representative kind of launches this investigation, which also sets this upcoming April 17th of 2025 as a deadline. So the investigation begins. They have 1 year to make their recommendations. 2 months ago, on Inauguration Day, the U.S. Trade Representative kind of concluded that their targeted dominance in shipping and maritime sectors was in fact a threat to U.S. commerce. In the middle of all of this, in late February, there was a draft executive order proposing a variety of port fees. So these are 2 separate but very interrelated processes going. So there's a U.S. Trade Representative process. They have the capacity and the authority under Congress to make their own kind of recommendations and policies with respect to kind of tamping down on Chinese maritime industry, as well as President Trump potentially having capacity to do that through an executive order. So most likely these would kind of be rolled into one that would be announced simultaneously, but these are actually kind of two different processes going on. So that's kind of the scene of how we're here. Before we discuss the policies, it's important to just kind of give a quick intro on vessels and the different characteristics. And so when you talk about a Chinese vessel, there's a few different things that you could mean. You could mean It was built in China, so where was it built? Who is the shipbuilder? Are they a Chinese company? Who operates the vessel currently? Typically, this is going to be a different nationality than where it was built. And then where is it flagged? So this is where the vessel is registered and pays taxes. And this could be different from who operates it, which in turn can be different from where it was built. So a lot of vessels, I have a pretty picture down here of the world's largest box ship. This is a vessel that's flagged in Panama because that's kind of advantageous for them kind of going through the canal. And here's a picture of one of the big shipyards over in China. So these are kind of three different characteristics that we want to kind of keep in our mind as we think about understanding these proposed policies. So the proposals, there's kind of different proposals that are floating around, but the one that has been kind of fleshed out and reported on the most clearly has 4 different potential components. And these would be additive, right? So this is not like a menu that we're choosing one option off of. This is the proposal is kind of all of these, and it's currently being hashed out at the federal level. So proposal number 1 is a service fee on Chinese operators. So if you're a Chinese operated ship and you're coming into the US, you would be charged $1 million. And the current proposal language is this is true kind of regardless of whether you're a massive ship or just a big ship, or whether you're arriving empty or with lots of high value cargo. Just $1 million, simple. If you're a Chinese operator, that's what you have to pay for access to American ports. The second is a fleet composition fee. So in this case, it's looking all around the globe at the fleets that are, at the vessels that are operated by a particular operator. What share of those were built in China? So you can see my little illustration here. You have a European operator, but they own both kind of Chinese built and non-Chinese built ships, and they would be charged based on that. And so these could range from, even if you just have a few Chinese vessels, that could be $500,000 up to $1.5 million for entry. So this is kind of much more impactful than the first policy, and it will explain a bit more on why in the next slide. So policy 2 is looking kind of currently, what's the current composition of your fleet? Policy 3 is looking forward, saying what ships have you ordered, and are you ordering ships from China? So here it would be, again, kind of similar values being floated in anywhere from $500,000 to around $1 million, depending on the share of your outstanding orders for vessels that are made with Chinese shipyards. So the purpose of this policy, at least as much as I understand it, is to shift people away from Chinese shipbuilders, whether that's kind of most likely to Japan, who's a major shipbuilding, Korea, or then, ideally, I guess, the United States. So this is the 4th piece of the policy, which is going to be kind of phased in slowly. So it would start with kind of 1% of US ships exporting out of the United States would need to be built and flagged in the US. And then that would be kind of ramped up over time. So one big question that isn't really well answered at this point is, how are these going to be enforced? So, to me, this sounds like something you'd have to have some sort of mandate, or permits would have to be given in order to export from non-US built ships. But there's kind of no clarity on that piece of the policy. So of the 4, this is kind of the least clear right now. So then a natural question kind of is, based on the current way that agricultural commodities are exported out of the US at their current locations, kind of in the Gulf or the Pacific Northwest, how binding are these policies, and who's likely to be directly impacted? So for the service fees on Chinese operators, not so bad for agriculture. So only about 10% of exports are going out on Chinese operated vessels. So that's good, both because it's a low number, and it means there's probably, we could get that number down even lower if we had to. 2 is trickier. So if you look at 2024 and you look at kind of the operators who are operating in the US, about 50% of vessels would have paid some fee. There's just not that many operators that have no Chinese vessels, because Chinese vessels are about 30%, 30 to 40, even some numbers closer to 50 of the global fleet. A bit lower in bulk cargo than in containers, but high across the board. Policy 3, it's gets even tougher. So more than 60% of current orders are with Chinese shipyards. And it's not exactly clear if there's operators who are like specializing in not ordering Chinese ships, but it seems pretty far-fetched, frankly. So everyone who's operating in the US probably has a lot of Chinese ships on order. And then the fourth is pretty simple because there are essentially zero US built and flagged vessels currently operating in agricultural exports. So this policy is really prospective, looking to the future, really hoping that we can, create a US shipbuilding industry that doesn't exist today. So in terms of who pays the fees, that's simple. It's the operator of the vessel. In terms of how that changes the prices for agricultural commodities or the quantities of agricultural products that can be exported, that's where it gets a bit trickier. One important piece of information is that many ag exporting vessels arrive empty. And the way that these proposed fees are constructed, that's bad news for agriculture because that means there's really no one else to kind of share these costs with. Unless you're willing to incentivize these vessels to come to take the product through through lower prices, they just won't come, right? So to incentivize the fees to be paid, prices would need to decrease at least some, or there would be kind of lower quantity of exports going out. So how much would kind of this increase in transportation costs be? U.S. Farm Bureau has an analysis saying 10 to 28 cents per bushel of soybeans. The American Soybean Association has a slightly higher estimate. I've made some own kind of crude calculations based on data that I have and coming to pretty similar numbers for corn and wheat. So if we just look at the past of kind of what the distribution of Chinese vessels in ag exports in the United States is, it's a somewhat bleak picture, I would say. So the question then is, to what extent can these supply chains adapt? Sorry, I want to make one more point about the ag exports vessels arriving empty. So that's for bulk cargo. That's not the case for things going out in containers, right? So in those ships, those are coming over carrying, iPhones or other goods from China, and those are kind of coming over really regardless of the desire to kind of then export U.S. agricultural products through the backhaul. So in that case, those exporters are in a better position where some of these costs will be shared, or in some cases with really high value merchandise, probably almost all of that cost will be paid through by the importers, higher prices to the importers rather than lower prices to the U.S. agricultural exporters. So how much kind of can the industry and the supply chains adapt, either through increasing American shipbuilding or shifting away from Chinese operators or kind of other ways to reduce the fees that are paid, or at least the fees that kind of burden U.S. agricultural exporters? So kind of 3 points here. There's a lot of potential to switch away from Chinese operators. So that first policy, probably not the biggest concern. There's just a lot of non-Chinese operators, especially Greek actually is a kind of one of the larger nationalities for specifically bulk cargo. There might be some potential to switch future orders out of Japanese shipyards, out of Chinese shipyards into Japanese shipyards. There would be some kind of additional cost. And Chinese ships are typically cheaper than Japanese built ships, but maybe there's some capacity there. The final policy relating to kind of U.S. built and U.S. flagged, that would just take a lot of time and frankly a really big change in the structure and capacity of American shipbuilding as it exists today. So it's kind of hard to see at least easy or easily implemented strategies to mitigate the cost of the policy there. So that's all that I have on this. We will have more answers on this within 2 weeks because there's a statutory deadline of April 17th to get more clarity, at least on the Section 301 portion of this.
I appreciate Matt, and that was a great rundown on the shipping side and specifically shipbuilding ownership flags and everything else going with that. So thank you there. I'm going to talk about the production cost side of, as it pertains to ag and the impacts more not so much the impacts that these tariffs are going to have, because that's really kind of impossible right now to actually calculate, but areas that may be impacted and things to look for as far as that goes. And so we kind of all decided and drew straws, and mine was the shortest. So it was my sort of task to try to define retaliatory tariffs versus reciprocal tariffs. And I spent a lot more time on this than you would actually think in trying to figure out exactly how we disentangle the two. And I guess what I came up with, and I'm using pretty textbook type definitions in this case, at least for retaliatory tariffs, to be sure. And long story short, or the condensed version, retaliatory tariffs are taxes or duties placed on imports coming into a country in response to some action that another country took. Okay, so that could be they put tariffs on some product that we export, or they put a policy in place that somehow limits exports, or maybe even a quota of some kind. And in response to that, another country or their trade partner puts a tariff on items that they export over to them. Now, one of the things with a retaliatory tariff is there's really no limit on how strong the response could be. You know, just because country A put a 10% tariff on doesn't mean country B has to respond in kind. It could be a much stiffer penalty. In other words, a retaliatory tariff can be punitive in nature and less about just, you know, actually causing harm rather than just trying to get a fair deal. And usually with retaliatory tariffs, when we use that term retaliatory, the response is fairly soon or quick. Okay. Now, as opposed to reciprocal tariffs, I've kind of defined it in my own mind and understanding as a form of retaliatory tariff, but with boundaries. Okay. So this definition is straight from the, you know, the White House page discussing reciprocal tariffs from the Office of the U.S. Trade Representative, and basically saying reciprocal tariffs are calculated as a tariff necessary to balance out bilateral trade between two nations, whether it's restrictions because of phytosanitary or quotas or just tariffs on goods being exported over to them. And I guess the biggest difference I would say is reciprocal tariffs, again, have a sort of boundary on it. There's a limit to how high the tariff would go in order to balance out trade. And then in response, if that other nation reduces the duties or relaxes some of those import restrictions, then in a reciprocal tariff environment, our tariffs would then come down in response. Okay. Whereas with retaliatory tariffs, it's not necessary that they come down. Again, it was a retaliation. So I guess that's the biggest difference that I see as those terms are used, is that reciprocal tariffs adjust as the other nation's laws and tariffs adjust, whether up or down. Retaliatory really doesn't have a limit on how high they could go, and there's no requirement that they actually come down if the other country does respond, depending on how punitive they want to make it. All right, so now moving on from that, let's talk about some production costs real quick. So fertilizer is one that has been discussed and bounced around a little bit in the news, and I just wanted to show you this pie chart that was built is the top fertilizer importing countries by spending in 2023. That's the latest data we have. And you can see the United States, that's the red piece of the pie there, imports about 10% of the global supply of fertilizer. Now, when it comes to a couple of the products, and you see on my slide I show here that phosphorus, first of all, already has a substantial tariff put on any imports. Now, we do not import a tremendous amount of phosphorus. 16% is kind of the max in any given year that we import. And there have already been tariffs on Moroccan phosphate as well as Russian phosphorus, and those actually were put into place considerable many months long before the Trump administration took office. Those were in response to political situations and scenarios involving Russia, as well as the belief that the Moroccan government is supporting unfair trade practices with their phosphorus production, and as a result, tariffs were put on. And again, this is prior to any of the tariff stuff that we're discussing today. Just letting you know that there's already tariffs in place on that specific fertilizer product. When it comes to nitrogen, that's another one. We don't import a lot of it, anywhere from 6 to 12%, usually much less than 12%. And 30% of that actually, of what we do import comes from Canada. But again, it's a small amount, and most estimates I've heard have stated that we can produce, at least for a while, about 100% of the nitrogen needs that the U.S. has. Okay. That may result in a little bit of price increases producing 100% because you get some inefficiencies when you're kind of pushing production to the max, but that's kind of what's been estimated there. So there's probably not going to be much movement in nitrogen costs as well as phosphorus costs if these tariffs that are already in place kind of tend to be the baseline as it is. We've already got them implemented and higher than in some cases than's been proposed. Finally, then we talk about potash, and that one has probably been in the news the most of all the fertilizer types, primarily because we import 90% of the potash we use as a country, and 85% of that, you multiply them together, you 76.5% comes from Canada. Okay. And the discussions of Canadian tariffs. Now, it has been said that potash actually falls under the USMCA trade agreement, and so that baseline 10% tariff is what will be applied to potash, not the 25%. So that it means that yes, it'll be tariffed, but not at the 25% rate that was initially stated, several weeks ago, that tariff will be much lower. So there's a specific carve out for that, and therefore the tariffs are going to have a more minimal impact on potash, which is good news as far as costs go, because that's one that we actually import the vast majority of usage in the U.S. Now, the other one that's going to potentially impact production cost items are the tariffs on steel and aluminum. Okay. So the steel tariff has been 25% and will continue to be 25%, into the future indefinitely. The difference with steel being that a lot of the carve-outs for steel manufactured products like stamped bumpers and things like that carve out, that exemption is going away, as well as exemptions for some of the countries that were basically not being held to this 25% tariff. For instance, Argentina, Australia, Brazil, and the EU had some carve-outs in that 25% steel tariff arena. Those are gone, as well as the exemptions for steel manufactured products. The aluminum side is to some extent a bigger deal, because the aluminum tariffs are going from 10% now to 25%. Okay. And much like the steel tariffs, those aluminum tariffs are removing the carve-outs for things like aluminum wire and everything else. And you see right here, and it's shown in the chart, U.S. imports of steel milled products. The largest country supplier of steel into the U.S. being Canada as of 2024, even outpacing the rest of the world. Brazil imports some, and that's why including those countries on carve-outs, Brazil being no longer exempt. 15.5% coming in at 25%, and that exemption going away on steel specifically. Now, when we talk about aluminum, I got this from this chart from the International Trade Administration, and you can see the top country that we get our aluminum from being Canada. Okay, this was for 2024, and how many billions of dollars worth of aluminum coming in, and for domestic consumption. And the bigger thing with aluminum related to steel is we only import, we import like 24% or so of the steel used. We import a much larger share of aluminum, the vast majority of that coming from Canada. And the biggest industry impacted as far as aluminum tariffs is going to be in the transportation sector. Okay, cars, light trucks, heavy trucks, those kind of things. We know a lot of car frames now are made of aluminum bumpers, aluminum wire, aluminum fasteners, and whatever else. And we can expect that a lot of that's probably going to trickle into ag, not just on farm and work trucks and things like that, but new equipment prices. So for the last 18 months or so, ag equipment prices had kind of flattened out. This is the new equipment cost index. We were following a period of rapid growth from 2021 to halfway through 2022 in new equipment costs. And then we'd kind of reached a point of flattening out. So when the initial tariffs on steel and aluminum went into place during the first trade dispute 2018 with China and everything else. If you look at that little increase there halfway between 2018 and 2019, that was a big cause of that increase there. Now with the steel tariffs and the carve-outs going away, you're probably going to see an increase in those steel costs again. But again, the bigger concern is with the no more carve-outs and then aluminum tariffs going from 10% to 25% across the board. Okay, so that's probably going to be the biggest areas where we might see some price responses and cost increases is, again, work trucks, farm vehicles, and then as well as equipment, which has already kind of soared when you compare to 2021 prices. And then the same thing goes for parts. So goes equipment costs. A lot of times so goes replacement parts. Now, one of the bigger ones that doesn't get as much traction as far as imports and exports and how much we import versus export, et cetera, has to do with herbicides, pesticides, and fungicides, which I'm lumping into agrochemicals minus, fertilizers. And so this table right here, I didn't create it, but I took it from the Ag Business Global journal who put this out. And what I really want to point to are some of these key agrochemicals that we use. For instance, one it's old, it's been around a long time, but you look at the very top row, 2,4-D, for instance. 58% of the 2,4-D sourced in 2022 came from China. Okay, that is quite a huge amount that coming into the country of a herbicide that we use a whole lot. Atrazine, 100% sourced from China. Now I know we don't use as much atrazine in the northern plains. I'm originally from Nebraska, and where atrazine's used a lot, and herbicide bills on things like corn and whatever else, where you've got high weed pressure of things like water hemp and Palmer amaranth and everything else, and you got to throw a cocktail at it. Atrazine's used quite extensively. Dicamba, 55% sourced from China, 40% from India. You look at down here, glyphosate, 98% coming from China in 2022. Paraquat, not used as much in North Dakota, but a desiccant nonetheless, especially used down south. 55% of that coming from China. And then you look at some common insecticides, permethrin, 92% from India. Okay, and India hasn't been discussed quite as much, but if we're putting tariffs across the board, likely some are going to apply to that. And so you can see it's going to affect insecticides. The bottom line being, as you look at this table and this chart here on the percentages that we actually import and the countries that they come from, that the bottom line, I guess, or the take home from this is there aren't very many active ingredients that are produced in the US anymore. Okay, and as a result, most of it's imported. They may be blended into whatever the brand name is, whether it's Mustang Max or something like that, but the active ingredients are sourced from other countries. That's probably going to pass through until there's such a time as where we can get some of this chemical manufacturing online and running in the US, which hasn't been really done, not in mass for quite a long time. Last thing I want to hit on, and this there was actually some comments on this from the Federal Reserve Chairman this morning, and talking about inflation and interest. And I show this chart that the Federal Reserve, as we are all well aware, has been increasing the federal funds rate to increase the overall cost of borrowing, to slow down inflation. You get slower growth, but hopefully that keeps inflation in check. When rates are cut, you can get higher economic growth, lower unemployment, but typically faster inflation. And I'm just showing this chart since about 2015 or so, the green line being the federal funds rate. All right, and we know it stayed at 5.5% or so from halfway through 23 through halfway through 24. About 7-8 months ago, the Federal Reserve started dropping rates. They dropped them a full percentage point into 2025. The consumer price index has been falling. This is the core inflation metric, but stubbornly it has just not fallen below 3%. And I'm using core inflation because it's probably, as far as inflation goes, one of the bedrock benchmarks that the Federal Reserve uses, and their target being 2%, and it just stubbornly isn't going below 3% or hasn't long before any of what's been going on had even been discussed. And as a result, we've seen interest rates kind of hovering either just below 7% and in some periods just above 7%. All right. And so here's some of the comments that were summarized in some of the articles I read this morning from the Federal Reserve Chairman Jerome Powell. And you can read them for yourself, but downside risks have risen a bit. Uncertainty is high. Economy's still in a good place. So that's kind of the key takeaway I took from this comment. And then they're talking about basically they don't know where things are going to come to rest, how big of an impact these tariffs are going to potentially have on prices, or how much of a balancing out there's going to be, how long they're going to be in place, how high in the end they're going to go, what's going to be the response from these other countries. Essentially through here, they're just saying they just don't know. So, and like they're kind of saying, tariffs are highly likely to generate a temporary rise in inflation, but they're saying that it's possible that it could be more persistent. Temporary would be prices spike up and then they come back down to close to where they are, or maybe, or maybe they're there for longer. So, but the other thing that they said, and I put this last quote in here, avoiding long-term inflation is their main goal, not necessarily stabilizing markets. Avoiding inflation is their main goal, not necessarily stabilizing markets. So that's an important comment or an important sentiment, basically stating the Federal Reserve isn't going to jump in to help save the equities market or something like that. Their primary focus is on stabilizing prices and avoiding high inflation and looking at the unemployment rate. If those things are still in flux or they want to wait and see what's going to go on with them, they're not that concerned with what goes on with all these other markets. And that's important to remember, that if you see the equities markets go down or something like that, that's not what they view their main role to be. It's full employment and stable prices. And that's what they're going to target. And so a lot of the sentiment of there being a full percentage point rate cut through the course of this year, or a half a percentage point rate cut, they've pulled back from that. They're basically saying our options are open and we're in a wait and see situation right now. And that's kind of where it stands. And again, these comments are from this morning. They're the most recent that we have. So with that, all I wanted to do was highlight that, Dr. Olson and Dr. Petry are going to talk about commodity markets and prices and trade and those things, and for good reason, because they're very important. But all I wanted to highlight was there's other areas in the ag sector that are likely to be impacted, and how much we just don't know. But it depends on how long, how high these tariffs go, and then the response of the countries that we receive a lot of these chemicals from. And that's really all I had. Again, I'll be on at the end to answer any questions you might have. So with that, I'll turn it over to Dr. Olson. Thank you.
All right, fantastic. Good afternoon, everybody. Frayne Olson, crop economist, marketing specialist with NDSU Extension. Here's my contact information. Again, we'd be happy to answer questions today. If there are some things you think about later on, please don't hesitate to try and contact me, and I'll get back to you as soon as I possibly can. So let's just dive right in. A couple things to summarize not only what Matt was talking about, but also what Brian was talking about. So first, to comment on some of the discussion about Matt Gammon's point on the shipping costs. The challenge we're going to face there, just to put this in context, is if those are to be in place, if they do come to fruition and they are implemented, in many cases, the majority of that additional cost is actually going to be pushed back through the system in the form of lower basis levels. So that is something that we need to be watching very, very closely. It likely will not have an impact on futures market prices from the bigger aggregate setting, but it will likely have some impact on local basis levels. So please keep your eyes and ears open for that as we move forward in time. So once again, I just want to make sure that we have these key issues in mind. So we were just talking about the U.S. reciprocal tariffs, the ones that the U.S. have put on products coming into the United States. And from the perspective that Brian just had, those have a direct impact on the costs that we as as farmers or farm managers, as consumers will pay. The exact amount we have to pay, the amount the prices will go up can vary significantly from product to product. But the fact is some of that tariff, some of that additional cost will be passed on to the end user or the consumer. Now, for the grains that we sell, for the output side of it, that doesn't have a direct impact. So just because the United States put on tariffs on products we bring into the US doesn't have a direct impact on the price or the value of soybeans or corn or wheat or any other product that we're exporting. But it does have an indirect impact. And that's what we've seen so far in the futures market in particular. When all this discussion about reciprocal tariffs and what was going to go on, what are those rates going to be, the grain markets, had some downward pressure on it, but they really didn't fall out of bed. And I think some people were surprised about that, but it's because of this indirect effect. So there is an increase in uncertainty, mainly from any potential retaliatory tariffs. So given the fact that we did this, what are our trading partners going to do? There's also a potential impact on buying and selling strategies, buying strategies by the international customers, selling strategies by the companies we have here in the United States, and in particular around some inventory buildup issues. So if there's this threat, do we see some of these countries that typically buy products from the US, are they going to try and increase their local inventories and buy up more ahead of any kind of potential retaliatory tariffs in their home countries or not? Obviously, cost of inflation is one of those concerns, as Brian brought up, cost of interest rates. But there's also this counterparty risk piece, and it's not something that's talked about a lot within the agricultural community or agricultural trade from a pricing standpoint, but it is important from a functionality standpoint. So counterparty risk basically means, is there a clause within a particular purchase or sale contract that has this often called a force majeure or an act of God? What happens if? And sometimes trade or political issues or tariffs are part of those acts of God. So if that were to happen, the contract the parties in the contract are released. In most cases, it truly is an act of God. It takes something like a flood or a fire or some kind of big, large natural disaster. A change in politics typically is not enough. However, there's also, again, this counterparty risk. What happens if this were to occur? Now, all of a sudden, the price of this product increased significantly. Does that force the two parties with this trading agreement, with this contract, does it force them to sit down and renegotiate where this increased cost is somehow shared between the buyer and the seller? And again, all of those things can happen. And there is this uncertainty, and there's typically some risk premium that's put into the marketplace. And in the world of tariffs, that usually means a downward pressure on prices. Now, the actual retaliatory tariffs, so when our trading partners actually do something that impacts the prices that we as the United States sell into their countries, whether it be a retaliatory tariff, where, for example, in the case of this morning, China put on additional tariffs on US products, that has a direct impact. Okay, so reciprocal, what US does usually has an indirect impact, but what our trading partners do has typically the direct impact. And that's what we saw this morning with the Chinese announcement. So what happened, China announced this morning, or actually over the night, that they were going to add an additional 34% tariff on all US products, including agricultural products. Now, there was earlier this morning, there was also a release by US Soybean Export Council. They had done the math on this to say what is the potential impact of this additional tariff on US soybeans. So this is in addition to what's already there. So let's very quickly, China has a 3% import tariff on all soybeans coming into the country, 3%. On top of that, a while back, they added a 10% tariff for US soybeans only. And now this morning, there's an additional 34% added on to that. Okay, so now we have, that's basically 47%. And then there's an additional 9% value-added tax, and that's the value-added tax is based on the value of the product. So based on their calculations, US Soybean Export Council, there's approximately a 60% tariff on the value of soybeans going into China. And most of that, the vast majority of that, is for U.S. soybeans, not necessarily for soybeans from, for example, Brazil or from Argentina. So this is going to put U.S. soybeans at a significant disadvantage, especially into the Chinese market. Obviously, we saw 35, almost 40 cent drop in soybean prices this morning on the futures market. It's softened a little bit from that. But we haven't seen as much of an impact on corn and wheat prices, and I'll talk about that in just a second. Now, what about the other trading partners? Fortunately, both Mexico and Canada were not included in these new additional reciprocal tariffs that President Trump announced on Wednesday. The existing tariffs on Canadian and Mexican products, as well as the steel and aluminum, are in place, but there were not any additional tariffs put on. So Mexico has already announced that as of today, as of now, they do not plan on placing retaliatory tariffs on U.S. imports. So far, the Mexicans said, well, let's see if we can negotiate our way out of this. Let's see if we can make some adjustments. We're not going to get into this tit-for-tat strategy and see how much pressure we can put on the U.S. government. The Canadians have announced additional retaliatory tariffs on U.S. cars and trucks, in particular automobiles, particularly those that are not covered by the USMCA. And so, from an agricultural standpoint, I don't know if that's going to make much of a difference. So two of our largest trading partners when it comes to agriculture specifically, both Mexico and Canada, we really haven't seen those big retaliations. Now, the Chinese came again out this morning. One of the interesting things, to follow up on Brian's comments earlier, one of the interesting things I'm going to be watching now is, given this additional 34% in China's import tariffs from U.S. products, if the reciprocal tariffs work the way people anticipate, that would suggest that, and I don't know if this will happen, but it would suggest that the U.S. might increase the reciprocal tariffs on China to compensate for this additional 34%. We're going to have to wait to see. I haven't seen any announcements yet. And finally, one of the other major trading partners we have, not probably as large from an agricultural grain standpoint or oilseed standpoint. We do send quite a bit of stuff into the European Union. They are right now discussing some level of retaliatory tariffs, but they haven't announced anything yet. And there is, based on my reading, some disagreement even within the European Union about the appropriate strategy to try and work with or not work with President Trump and his administration. So just for reference point, I wanted to give you an idea, which countries do we need to be watching? So what I tried to do here is, for example, corn exports, which are the big countries that we sell corn to? And what I've done is plotted this backwards in time over history. So historically, starting in about 2000, how much have we sold to each one of these countries per marketing year? And again, this is as of the most recent marketing year. I'll talk a little bit about sales so far this year. So notice on the far right-hand side, this is the totals from this last marketing year. Mexico is our #1 customer, with Japan being #2 and Colombia being #3 in volume. So this is in dollars. It's not in dollars. This is in metric tons. Notice also that China historically has not been a really big buyer of U.S. corn. They have in the past. There have been spikes, for example, in that 2011, 2012 timeframe. But the big one that everybody's looking at is that in that 2020, 21 timeframe, and that was primarily because of the Phase 1 agreement. So that was really based off of a trade agreement, not necessarily off of market conditions. Now, how have our export sales so far this season? Actually, exports to Mexico are up relative to this same time last year. Japan, the same thing. Our exports, corn exports into Japan, are up relative to last year. Colombia is up. China has basically bought nothing. They bought about a half a vessel worth of corn from the United States. So they have essentially dropped off the face of the earth. As a result, this 34% tariff announced this morning is really not going to have an impact on corn prices, because in today's world, in today's marketplace, we're really not shipping any corn to China anyway. South Korea, Canada, Taiwan round out the kind of the top 7. So I just, again, want to put this in context to say, when we think about retaliatory tariffs, when we think about trade with other countries, which countries do we need to focus on? I want to emphasize Mexico is important, Japan is going to be important, as well as Korea and Canada. So as we're going through these slides, please pay attention to the countries that we're talking about. On soybeans, now this one is kind of the stark contrast. Soybeans are very different. We do send a significant amount of our soybeans into the Chinese market. You can see the volumes that we've shipped historically since about 2000. Yes, Mexico is our second largest buyer of US soybeans, but it's a distant second. So thus the reason that we've seen a very large market response because of this additional 34% tariff on US soybeans. I think the marketplace is anticipating some of that, but the 34% I think was a little bit larger than what others had expected. So our challenge now in soybeans is that when we're selling soybeans as United States, we export whole soybeans. Okay, so we need to send our soybeans to countries that have crushing capacity. And China is the largest soybean crusher, oilseed crusher in general, over the whole world. So China's number one in crush, the US is number two, Brazil and Argentina kind of flip-flop back and forth between number 3 and number 4. So obviously we're not going to sell US soybeans into the Brazilian or the Argentine market. So if we take China off, we already are crushing about as many soybeans in the US as we can. We're not going to sell into Brazil and Argentina to crush our soybeans, which now leaves the 5th largest being the European Union. And if you notice, we have Spain and Germany as individual countries listed on this graphic. And we did see an increase in the last trade war with China back in the 18-19 time frame. We did send more soybeans into the European Union, but it wasn't large enough to compensate. So the response, going back one slide, in corn, we have this ability to be able to shift to other countries. It's very easy to try and find other homes for corn if we can get our prices low enough. For soybeans, it's different because now we got to sell whole soybeans into countries that have the crushing capacity, and that's a much, much shorter list. Okay, so it's going to be more challenging to try and find an alternative market for our whole soybeans. Moving on to wheat, this is all wheat blended together. I'll show you a spring wheat chart in just a moment. Notice over the last several years, Mexico has become our number one wheat buyer. Philippines, also very important. The Japanese market has been very important, but has been decreasing over time. Last year, China did come in and buy some US wheat. This year, they bought almost nothing. So again, that's why the wheat market has not really responded to the information we got this morning. And then we get into South Korea, Taiwan, and Egypt. So from a wheat standpoint, we still have Mexico, Philippines, Japan, Korea. We did add Taiwan. And the interesting thing now with Taiwan is going to be, given the tensions, the political tensions between China, the United States, and then China's claim on Taiwan as a division of China, this trade with Taiwan is going to get very, very tricky. And it has been kind of politically sensitive, but obviously, given all the things that are going on right now, that's increased the potential risk for trade with Taiwan. When we look specifically at hard red spring wheat, again, just to wrap things up, the red line again is the Philippines. So Philippines, very, very important country for US spring wheat exports. Number 2 is Mexico, seeing some common themes here. Mexico has increased their purchases of US spring wheat significantly over the last several years. Japan historically has been a good, steady customer of ours. And again, the trend line has been downward. Taiwan has been a very good, steady customer. Korea, Thailand, and Vietnam. So a lot of the Southeast Asian countries, as well as some of the North Asia countries in the form of Japan and South Korea, also on this list. So as we think about retaliatory tariffs, how are our trading partners going to respond to what the United States has done? We really need to focus on these. So anytime that you hear a Mexico or a Canada, or in particular Japan or Southeast Asia, your ears should be perking up, and it's important to watch. So my last comments, and I'll wrap things up and hand things over to Tim. There's a lot of questions I get about what is the objective? What's kind of the end game of these tariffs, the new trade strategy from the United States? And these are the kind of the list of things that I have heard talked about, not only from President Trump himself, but also from some of his cabinet and key officials. Obviously, reducing illegal fentanyl and immigration flows was the key factor in Canada and Mexico trade relations. Reducing the U.S. trade deficit from an economist standpoint, there's still some debate how important that really is for the long-term financial success of our economy in the United States, but we'll leave that debate for another day. Try and increase government revenues. It's a new revenue stream for the U.S. government because the tariffs go into the U.S. Treasury. Is it to incentivize investment in U.S. manufacturing, including automobiles? Yes, that's also something that's been talked about significantly over the last several weeks. And is it to encourage some bilateral trade negotiations to try and renegotiate some of the trade agreements we have with some of these countries? Now, my comment is all of those are important. And they're not necessarily mutually exclusive. It's not that there has to be one on top of the other, that basically the strategy now has the potential to have an impact on all of those. But there is a difference in timeline. And this is where I really want to start thinking about, so if these tariffs are put in place, how long do they need to be in place for us to reach these objectives? Well, if it's to try and renegotiate some bilateral trade agreements, that could come relatively quickly. That could be just several months and we could see some of these tariffs disappear. But if it's to try and incentivize investment and build new manufacturing plants, that's something that's going to take years. So these tariff relationships and the new trade relationships, it's not an all or nothing. We may see some of these last for many, many years. Others may come and go relatively quickly. And so this all has implications, especially for agriculture, because the longer that these alternative supply chains, so if I'm a country that has normally been buying products from the United States, and now all of a sudden because of my country's policies, I'm going to shift to a different supply chain, like in the case of China. Once these alternative supply chains become more efficient, the longer the supply chain is used, it tends to be more efficient, it becomes more stable, it becomes more reliable. It becomes much more difficult to switch back to the original supply chain. So one of my longer term concerns is the longer that these tariffs are in place and the more that people have a chance to change and adapt, in particular some of our trading partners, it will become more and more difficult for us to try and regain some of the market share that we may have lost over time. So hopefully those comments will try and put some context behind some of your decision making in the near future. And I will stop sharing for right now and I'll hand things over to Tim Petry.
Okay, good afternoon, everybody. Tim Petry. We're going to talk a little bit about the same thing we've been talking about here, tariffs and so on. So let's move along. If you were on our last webinar, I showed you this slide, but actually it was for volume, and now I've changed it to value or dollars because that's what's important in tariffs. So, the U.S. is a major player in the world meat market. We are the #1 producer of beef and chicken, and #2 in pork, only behind China. We're also a very major player in the export market, and very important to us in terms of prices. We are the largest exporter of beef. At least it's high quality beef and beef on a value basis. Sometimes Brazil, well, always Brazil, but sometimes Australia would send more or export more beef. But in terms of high quality and value, we are the very much the leader there. In pork, we're the largest exporter, and in chicken, we're second only to Brazil. So, very, very, very important there. I'm glad that Matt talked about shipping, because when we look at our export customers here, like Frayne did on grains, shipping could be a very big deal for us, maybe even bigger than tariffs, because you start looking at our customers there, and just for beef, for example, Korea, Japan, China, all Southeast Asia, the main place a lot of that goes out of is Oakland. And it goes in containers. It's fresh, chilled, or frozen. And so the big question there is, are those ships coming in with containers can, do they have refrigeration? And then do they pay that million upon million or whatever it is that thankfully that Matt talked about? And then we don't have to pay, because if we would have to pay, that would really, really reduce our ability to export, particularly on byproducts, because byproducts in themselves are low value here, but if we have to add on a whole bunch additional costs on them, that would really slow that up. So the shipping is something we're really going to watch. Other than that, then it's how do our customers react or retaliate to other tariffs for other things that might be put on or whatever. And so we can kind of go down the line there. Beef is a 10 last year was a 10.5, as you see there, a $10.5 billion value to us with the meat and the exports. So very, very important there. Our major customers going down are Korea and Japan. We have trade agreements with both of those countries negotiated by the last Trump administration. I'll leave China for a minute. Then we go down to Mexico and Canada. Again, our situation with Mexico and Canada has not changed. We have free trade with them. But going back up to China, that's kind of a whole different situation there. And China has been our third best customer, but China has greatly increased beef imports. In the last 10 years, they went from importing very little, if any, to they're by far the largest importer of beef in the world. And because of that, and they've really ramped it up in the last year or so, not only from us, but Brazil, Australia, Argentina, Uruguay, and all this beef coming in. And so because of that, at the request of the Chinese beef producers and organizations there, on December 27th, China launched a beef import investigation. And so they notified us, Brazil, Australia, Argentina, Uruguay, that we're going to look at things. We feel we're getting too much beef in here and what's going to happen. And so they did reduce some of the packing plants that can go in. And actually on March 16th, our approval for all our plants for beef, pork, and chicken came up for renewal, and China did not renew beef, but they did for pork and chicken. So that means at the present time, we are not exporting beef to China, which is our third biggest market there. So, that's kind of a big deal. We have to watch it. Again, they said that, they just had a meeting there a couple of weeks ago where all those countries attended, and they laid out their issues and how are we going to remedy that. So, that's all to be seen. When we lose our third biggest customer there, certainly could have a price impact. Then going on over to pork, that again is a big deal, $8.6 billion there. And again, a lot of the countries are the same there. So you just have to wait and see what happens. Now, when we go to meat imports, the other thing that could affect our prices is we do also import beef and pork and a lot of lamb. For instance, on lamb, we, from Australia and New Zealand are the biggest places we get lamb from, and we get about 73% of our lamb consumption in the U.S. comes from overseas. So, that's a concern for our industry there, and maybe more on that in a minute. So go over to beef then. We have a trade agreement with Australia. Have had it for many, many years where we had a zero tariff. As long as the queue there, which you go down to the bottom, as long as they stay within their quota, we have a pretty good sized quota with them. And so they ship beef here free. If they go over the quota, then we put a 21.1% tariff. And now recently then with the 10% tariff on Australia, now there's a 10% tariff even for the under quota for Australia. Canada and Mexico, as Frayne said, we have the USMCA, free trade back and forth. I'll just go down to New Zealand and Uruguay next, and then come back up to Brazil. With New Zealand and Uruguay, we have a tariff rate quota of 4.4 cents per kilo. And so then now 10% has been added to that. So, will that slow up imports from those countries is yet to be seen. It's too early to say. Going back up to Brazil, then Brazil has to, you see that TRQ there. Brazil shares a tariff rate quota with all other countries except, we just mentioned New Zealand and Uruguay and also Argentina. Those, we have special quotas with all those countries. All the other countries, Brazil and everybody else that might send beef in here, share a quota, and that's small enough that gets filled in January. And so in Brazil's case, that TRQ again is 4.4 cents per kilo, but after that, then again they have to go on a kind of one-by-one basis, and I think recently we announced a 36.4 on Brazil. So again, wait and see what happens there. Go to again, I mentioned lamb and mutton imports, and the U.S. sheep industry is very concerned with the amount of imports. Again, we get a lot of lamb in here. And so 73% of our consumption, and so we did put 10% tariffs on New Zealand and Australia. Australia is the real big one there. And so, no retaliation yet or anything, and not to be seen, but the sheep industry would I think, prefer the administration to do some more with those lamb and mutton imports there. So, how did the market react here? And so in the market, yesterday obviously did react. They have feeder cattle futures on the upper left-hand corner. Yesterday we're down about 450, and then go to the right hand or go to the bottom, just go to the bottom then. Today then feeder cattle futures were down the limit. The limit move is 825, and so then that spurs an additional tomorrow, Monday, the limit expands, and so could go to 1225. So the market has really reacted negative, not knowing what's going to happen with the shipping or retaliatory tariffs and so on. And then again, the live cattle futures on the other side yesterday was down about 270, and then down about 650 today. So the market is very uncertain. Last week, or this week, and quite a few auction markets were closed because of the weather, and so there's a holdover cattle that were going to come in this week that come to next week. Stockman's did have a sale yesterday, and the market did not seem to be affected very much at that time. In fact, was steady to even up a little bit. So just have to see what happens next week. I know there's a lot of concern with producers, and I've been getting calls from them, and should I hurry and bail out or whatever, and a lot of uncertainty. Now, one other thing then, since the feeder cattle futures went down the limit today, that means that there will be no LRP contracts sold, because when the market goes down the limit, then there's no LRP provided. So with that, I'm going to stop sharing and turn it over to Dave.
Great, thanks, Tim. Everybody can see my screen.
Yes.
Great. Have some comments about what's going on in bioenergy, then we'll get to questions here shortly. A variety of things going on, obviously, and they hit bioenergy in a couple of ways. Of course, the products themselves, feedstocks, and then there's also this idea of what's going on in the general economy. Trade is really important to the biofuels industry in the United States. Imports and exports at the margin can make quite a difference in terms of profitability. a lot of our trading partners in the biofuel space have been in the news, or are kind of those headline nations, and we've mentioned their names a number of times: Canada, Mexico, China, Brazil, among them. Just a quick summary here, the few times we do have a new 10% tariff on energy imports from Canada and Mexico. This was adjusted about a month ago to hit that number again. USMCA is in place for certain products. There's a 10% tariff on energy. Then there's a 25% tariff on non-compliant USMCA goods. Also have a new 10% retaliatory tariff on Brazilian imports. Obviously, Brazil is a major producer of sugarcane ethanol, so that has implications globally. And then, of course, we have import on Chinese goods. 34% of that is that new retaliatory tariff announced on Wednesday. Just going into the next thing, and just to kind of illustrate what's going on. So this is a chart of U.S. corn ethanol production, exports, and production capacity. So the blue line is production capacity. That's the nameplate capacity we have in terms of annual production of corn ethanol in gallons. And you can see there's a bit of a gap there between the stacked areas, the orange being what we actually use here in the United States, and that red for what we export. It ends up being about 12%, a little bit over 12% of our production is exported. And again, on the margin, that makes a tremendous difference, especially since we have this excess capacity. And excess capacity puts a lot of downward pressure on ethanol profitability. That almost 2 billion gallons of ethanol requires about 650 bushels of corn to produce, and that's just for scale. That's more than we produce in North Dakota, more than we produced last year, which was a little bit higher in terms of acreage. Moving on to where the material goes, and here we see some names come up. Maybe a surprise, maybe not. So right now, Canada is by far our biggest export market for ethanol. A great deal of corn ethanol goes up that way, including from the Northern Plains, from North Dakota, because of our rail access. I've talked about that previously. And then if we look at some of these other markets, maybe not even just where they're at, but actually the recent growth. So the United Kingdom, the Netherlands, Colombia, a lot of these, Mexico, especially since COVID, a lot of these are recently developed markets where we've invested a lot of effort to build those relationships and to start trading into those markets. Interestingly, and I've talked about this before, we actually export very little to Brazil. Beginning in 2018, they introduced a 18% import tariff, which really limited the U.S.'s competitiveness into that market. And China is also interesting. At a time they did buy, especially then, a relatively large amount of ethanol as percentage of exports. They moved away from that, and their main goal was they were going to build corn ethanol production capacity in country to have that industry there, but actually rely to some extent on exports to support that. And of course, Frayne visited about some of the implications for corn exports into China, which would be affected by what we're talking about. Next, just to talk about what's been going on in renewable diesel. And this is actually similar to what we see in biodiesel. See, these are imports. Renewable diesel recently has really been coming from two places, Canada and also Singapore. The amount of biomass-based diesel, so both renewable diesel and biodiesel, has fallen significantly in 2025. And that's because we've gone from having a blender's tax credit, which the origin of the biofuel is not important, to 45Z, which is a production tax credit. So because the renewable diesel imports would have been produced in another country, they wouldn't be eligible for that. And so obviously the profitability or the margins for those imports has declined significantly. And we've seen that impact in terms of the import volumes that have occurred. Just a few things to kind of summarize, and then we'll move into questions. And some of the almost contradictory things that have happened. So Brazil actually as a nation has relatively high import tariffs. On average, somewhere between 17 and 19%. It happens to be 18% for ethanol. So high tariffs, but they actually run a trade deficit with the United States. They buy a lot of U.S. energy. And because they have a small deficit, they were hit with that 10% retaliatory tariff. At the same time, we have Singapore. I mentioned them as until recently, that one of the bigger origins of renewable diesel. We actually have a free trade agreement with them. We've had it for about 20 years. And even though we have a free trade agreement, they've been hit with a 10% retaliatory tariff. Already talked about China, and of course, that's the impact primarily on soybean and corn. But of course, that feeds back here in the United States, where we're going to have with an absence of other markets, or those lost sales, we're going to have supply growing here. It's going to stay here without a home, increasing ending stocks. Just two last little points. It has been stated by Canada publicly that they may retaliate against U.S. actions by introducing an import tariff on ethanol. Again, that would be a direct impact on that industry. And again, you saw how important that is as relatively for a destination. And then finally, too, given the discussion that we've had about shipping and those new potential costs on shipping, just to kind of do some back of the envelope math, the Panamax vessel is somewhere between 1.5 and 2 million gallons in terms of capacity. So if we think about that and the magnitude of what those additional fees would be, you're talking about an extra approximately 50 cents a gallon for fuel that might be shipped if it was all assigned to just that part of the trip. And again, that 50 cents would be impactful. It's a relatively large amount when you think about the landed cost of getting fuel from here in the United States to another destination. With that, we're almost ready for questions. I'll summarize a couple of things. First of all, thank you everyone for joining us. We do have questions, which is great. You're welcome to ask more questions as we go. Our official philosophy, I think, was that we were going to answer questions until they're exhausted, or it might be until we're exhausted. We'll see. We do have, this is actually a special webinar, as I mentioned. We're going to continue our regular webinars. Our next one is scheduled for Thursday. The WASDE comes out next week. We'll be back next Thursday. Hopefully we're done with questions by then. But we'll go ahead and open those up, and we'll just assign those as we go. And I imagine Frayne's going to be pretty popular. I'm glad that Ron came on, because there's a couple of questions that are probably in your alley as well. So, and in fact, Ron, if you're ready, since you turned on your camera, and Frayne, if you want to jump into the tariffs, are they going to have any impact on the choice of ARC or PLC?
I'll let Ron take that one first. He studied that a lot harder than I have.
I guess if you assume that the tariffs are going to depress the markets, if you make that assumption first, well, yeah, then you would affect the PLC then if the prices drop below the reference price. So yes, it would change it, but I still think ARC looks more favorable just because we've got such a good benchmark from the previous high years of yield and price. So
great, thanks, Ron. Next question, this kind of Frayne or Brian. For chemical or fertilizer that's prepaid, is it possible that a dealer would actually pass some of the tariff cost on to that buyer, or is the dealer going to take the hit?
Well, so like we didn't really formally say so, but it's important to, and Frayne can jump in, understand the mechanics of when a tariff is paid and who writes the check. So let's use potash, for example, because we import a lot of it from Canada. if there is a 10%, if you have bought potash, let's say directly from Canada, you bought it from a Canadian supplier, in order to get that component across the border, you have to show up at the customs office essentially, or however, you have to write a check for the 10% tariff on potash to get it into the country. Then from there, it goes on to the end user and they pay the bill. So in theory, if I had bought it prepaid, let's say I bought it 3 months ago, a big order to be delivered in June, and the tariff goes into effect before that point, in order to get it across the border, I got to write that check for the 10% tariff. Even though I paid for it 4 or 5 months ago, to get it across the border after the tariff goes into effect, that check has to be written. Okay. So if you've prepaid for fertilizer that's already here, then not necessarily no check needs to be written, but that doesn't necessarily mean that there won't be some cost passed on in anticipation of acquiring more. That's going to be on the dealers at their discretion. There's no tariff that needs to be paid for fertilizer that's already here. In other words, that's right. Unnecessary. So it really depends on where it is when the tariffs go into effect. And then if the dealer essentially is trying to mitigate some costs down the road by increasing the price, because, in theory, but if it's prepaid, I don't think the tariff would be applied if it's already here. I don't think that would be passed on. Again, it all depends on when it crosses the border, not Correct. When you bought it. At Correct. This point. That
is the way that the system usually works. And so Brian is absolutely right. And so the material that's in-house right now, that's ready to be applied this spring, that's safe. That is not going to be tariffed. But even as Brian mentioned, even if you've purchased it and even made a down payment on it, but you haven't received it yet, it will be tariffed when it comes across the border. So it's when the product crosses, not what you paid for it or when you paid for it. Okay. Now, the other part to that is for example, the refill, because there's a lot of elevators right now, a lot of agronomy centers. They have the most of their needs right now. They're working on, okay, what about the supply chain for the refill? We can't quite get through entire spring's work with what we have in inventory right now. There's always a refill that's needed to be able to make it to the end of the season. And those are obviously the tons that we're concerned about. Now, will those go up in price? And the answer is, well, it depends. My favorite word in the dictionary. And it does depend upon what the local competition is, what some of your competitors have had to pay for it. So a lot of that comes down to the local competition and how much that you as a customer, as a farm manager, might have to pay, how much of that can be passed along to you versus how much of that additional tariff is going to be covered or basically absorbed into the cost of production for the fertilizer dealer. So that one's a little trickier, but the mechanics of when is the tariff paid and who pays for it and who has to write out the check that goes to the Treasury, that's pretty clear cut.
I saw the next question come through and I was thinking about that, a post on the tariffs that are imposed against us. Yes, it is possible to find that. The World Trade Organization actually publishes a list of by country what tariffs are imposed on groups of goods. That the thing in this situation, though, is that just shows the tariffs. It doesn't necessarily show quotas and phytosanitary restrictions that may be imposed against the United States and other things like that. So if you look straight up at just the tariffs imposed against the U.S., you will notice that the ones that we are putting in as reciprocal tariffs are much higher. Okay. And so the argument from the administration is that, well, the tariffs are one part of the trade barriers that we have to getting into these other countries. There's other barriers that exist too, as I just mentioned. And so if you just look at the tariffs, it won't fully capture the barriers that they're talking about. So I don't have a list. I mean, maybe one of you guys knows of one that encapsulates it better than what I'm discussing, but we can find the tariffs through the WTO tracks that stuff.
Now, the one other comment I'll make is I agree with you, Brian. I'm not aware of any like master list or place that somebody's already done that. Maybe there is someone out there that has put that together, but please realize that that would be an exceptionally long list because we're looking at all of the different trading partners and all of the different countries that are buying from or selling to, and each one of those items will be listed separately. And so to give you an idea, depending upon how granular or fine-tuned you want this, is it just for soybeans, or is it for commercial soybeans and food grade soybeans? Is it for all wheat? Is it for wheat seed used? I mean, wheat that's used for seed versus wheat that's used for milling versus flour. It could be bran. I mean, you can take the wheat and wheat products and divide those down into very, very small segments. And so this gets to be kind of challenging to put together a list. And then on the livestock side, it gets to be even worse because you can get into specific cuts of meat, not just, is it hamburger? Is it a steak? Is it a T-bone? Are they the chicken paws, the chicken feet, or are they wings? They can all be classified differently. So that's actually a lot more complicated than it first seems.
Yeah, that phase one agreement, that's many pages long that we had with China. Many pages long, by identical little things. Even soybeans, there's probably, I don't know, is there 5, 6 different?
Yep. There were subcategories of soybeans.
Then in meat, it's gigantic.
Yeah, one thing I'd add too, on Wednesday, the president had a copy of the just released U.S. Trade Representative's Foreign Trade Barriers report. And I had the pleasure last week to read through it, looking for biofuel trade barriers. And it's a very long document. It's 400 pages. For last year, was 400 pages for this year's edition, but it's not complete. It's not anywhere close to being complete. It just illustrates the many ways in which it can hit. And in fact, USTR, has 14 different categories for trade barriers, and tariffs just being one of those. And Brian talked about a lot of the other ones. It's really getting your hands around it, even when things aren't changing, is pretty unwieldy. And now, of course, by the minute, there could be significant developments. Next question we have, how will the crush plants in North Dakota mitigate the prices of soybeans? Last time it was devastating to the market. So I'll throw this to Frayne.
Yeah, okay. So it will help, but it'll be minimal. So the challenge that the crushing plants or an ethanol plant has is they only have so much capacity for per day or per week or per month. Plus they only have so much storage capacity. So typically what happens is the local crush plant will only bid prices just high enough to prevent it from getting on a train and leaving. And that's about all they have to do. And that's about all they can do. Because if they suddenly had a much, much higher price, they wouldn't have the storage facilities to be able to store it, let alone the capacity to be able to crush it or process it fast enough. So yes, it will help, but it's not going to be a big difference. Most of those, the adjustments in basis, obviously the futures price is going to take care of the big macro adjustments, the more micro adjustments on your local marketplace. It will help. It's not going to be as bad, but it's not going to be as much as a person would think because the local crusher only has so much capacity and so much ability to be able to crush at a certain pace. I wish I had a better answer, but that's the reality.
Another marketing question. What would your advice be? Empty the bins? Because prices are going to get worse.
So it depends. In my mind, it depends upon, again, it depends. It depends upon the crop. And the other part is it depends upon your risk appetite. What I said at the very end, or my last comment was, part of the biggest challenge I struggle with is how long do we think some of these tariffs and some of these trade pressures will continue? If this is something that will be relatively short-lived, let's say a few months, and we'll be able to get back to more of a normal trading pattern, in particular for agricultural products. I don't know that cleaning the bins out today would be a very smart move. But there's risk in that because some of these could last for an extended period of time. The one that I'm most concerned about, to be very blunt, is soybeans. Now, hopefully most of you have old crop soybeans marketed already, so you're really more worried about new crop soybeans. But if you haven't, I mean, that would be probably not the exception to my rule. I think if you do have some old crop soybeans in the bin, I think that would be something I would be looking at pretty seriously, trying to get priced at least for delivery sometime before spring's work. Now, the other part to that is on soybeans specifically, we are looking at lower planted acreage this year. And given the prices right now and the uncertainty in the marketplace, I don't know if we're going to see additional shifting out of soybeans. I know there are some people now starting to talk about that, you know, given the outlook and if there's a continued strained relationship between the United States and China in particular, this could be a bit of a tough long road for the soybean market, and we might see some additional cuts in soybean acres. Now, again, the challenge of that becomes, well, if you're not going to plant beans, what do you plant? I know corn pops to mind, but we are already going to have a pretty healthy corn plantings this year, and it doesn't take long to overdo corn as well. So, you know, I wish I had solid advice. It really does depend upon your financial condition, how much appetite you have for risk. Are you willing to take some risks and gamble that this will be a short-lived event? If you are concerned this is going to be a long haul, if you think this is something that's going to last for an extended period of time, then I'd be much more aggressive in trying to either price and get rid of my old crop and or price a little higher levels of some of my new crop.
Great. Next question. I think this is for Brian. Tariffs, aren't they essentially providing money to our government like taxes so that citizens have less money to spend on living?
Well, it gets a little bit theoretical in that standpoint because yes, tariffs are a tax. I mean, that's what they are. They're a tax on imported goods, and that money has gone to the government. But the notion behind it, though, is to promote other growth in the economy. For instance, more manufacturing, more jobs within the economy that's imposing the tariffs, which in theory then raises wages and standard of living, and then potentially more access of U.S. exports, making them more competitive. So there's an increase in production and more economic growth within the country. So it really depends on, we're going to say it depends a lot. It really depends on short run versus long run. That's critically important. It depends on if what the tariff's intended impact is, and if that intent is achieved, if that goal is achieved, and a lot of other factors. So that's why any of these trade conversations get really complicated, because you know, who's the winner and who's the loser and who's collecting the money here. That all depends on a lot of things like what we call elasticities. How many close substitutes are there, and how many other suppliers are there for this product, and then how fast does the other country acquiesce if they do it all, those kind of things. So that the answer to that question, I'm not trying to be evasive. It really is nuanced to the point of a lot of if this then this, if this then this, and then what's possible. That's the best I can answer it, unfortunately.
Thanks, Brian. Question, is ethanol from the U.S. and Canada in compliance with USMCA? So ethanol is included in USMCA, so it is a subject to free trade. In the initial announcement by the Trump administration, it was going to have the 10% energy tariff. Right now, to my knowledge, it doesn't. That it did get pulled back, but it sits there actually on both sides of being a target for import quotas either into the United States or into Canada. And again, it's the bigger question again, because we don't import much, if any, ethanol. It's what Canada does that's going to matter in that case. Next question. I'll actually throw this over to Matt. Hopefully he likes it. Sounds like E15 needs to be the minimum fuel blend in the country to make use of the corn that we have.
So I'm picking up on a bit of tongue in cheek in that comment. I don't know if that was true or not. So there is, good progress on getting year-round eligibility for E15. So in some of the neighboring states, the EPA's kind of new waivers have gone through, and we should probably see that this summer with Minnesota, South Dakota, Iowa having E15 year round, of a mandatory minimum of E15. That seems pretty unlikely to me anytime soon. I don't know, Dave can disagree, but yeah, small,
I think that's a great
small
answer,
sliver of good news. Yeah.
Yep. I think for Frayne, the impacts of tariffs on the price of durum.
Yeah, so right now, it's not really having a direct impact on durum prices. We do import, the United States does import a fair amount of durum from Canada, but because durum is one of those crops covered under USMCA, it's still allowed to go back and forth across the border without any kind of tariffs at this point. So we do, the United States doesn't export a lot of durum. We do, the biggest buyer of US durum is actually Italy. It goes into the European market. To my knowledge, the Italians have not put on any retaliatory tariffs on US products. So that trade flow should still be based on, essentially market conditions. So as of right now, there isn't any direct impacts on the durum market.
We want to throw the next one to Tim, Dave?
Absolutely. I'll read it and then Tim, you can answer. Since when can one man in this country unilaterally put tariffs on basically every country in the world without any input or agreement from Congress? I do not see how this will benefit the United States. I can see a worldwide recession coming on like we've never seen before, all of which would be self-inflicted. What's going on?
No, I'm going to let Frayne answer it, but I'll go on to the next question. What's the potential for the lamb market with imposed tariffs? Well, we put 10% tariff on Australia and New Zealand, our biggest customers. Their prices are quite a bit lower than domestic lamb prices. So, it might have a little impact on what's going in, but we're a major customer for them. So I would think that it would not affect the market to a great deal as of now.
And then there's another question about a statistic.
Yeah, the next one's about lamb as well. You might as well keep going, Tim.
Yeah, well, it's the cost of production in Australia and New Zealand is less than ours, and so over time we've been importing more and more from them, and Costco and other places can, I suppose, sell it cheaper. So, we just been importing more and more every year as well, except for 2023.
Okay, so I'm going to try and take on that other question. And Matt, please jump in and comment if you wish as well. Under the Constitution, the Congress has the ability to be able to, or has authorization, is given authorization to approve trade agreements as well as approve tariffs. But over time, the president and the administrative branch of our government has been given special authorities under different provisions over time to be able to do this, to put on tariffs and to negotiate trade agreements unilaterally, meaning that the administration has that authority. There's actually a long list of them, but the ones that are currently being used, is Section 201, Section 301, and Section 231 are the ones that are kind of the current pool that are being used. So yes, Congress has given the president unilateral authority to be able to do this. I will comment that the language for those different sections is fairly broad, and so it is open for interpretation. And I do think that there are some people that are looking at that saying, well, we're going to challenge some of this in the court system to make sure that President Trump is not extending beyond his authority. But given the current language and my understanding of the language, there is very broad authority given. And so I'm not a legal scholar, and so I'll have to leave that to those that know it better. So based on our current system, what President Trump is doing is currently allowed within the general boundaries. And Matt, again, if you want to comment on some of that, please go ahead.
I just want to add, yeah, Broad totally agree with all of that. There is, I mean, just recently, like this morning, Chuck Grassley, a Republican in Iowa, obviously farm export's very important to his state. So he's, along with Senate Democrats, have introduced some legislation to try and claw some of this power back. So, I mean, I think that's one possible way that this ends, is kind of a discontent in Congress with some of these tariffs and trying to kind of legislate more guardrails on when tariff power can be used. There'll be court cases as well, but yeah, so there is kind of some potential congressional disagreement, but yeah, broad tariff power sits with the executive in the system.
I think we'll go ahead and wrap things up. And I want to thank everybody for joining us today. I want to thank all the presenters and all of our attendees, both regular and new this time. As I mentioned, we'll be back on Thursday of next week for our regular webinar. That will probably have a lot of trade and tariff content in it, but we might have some other things too. As I mentioned, this webinar is being recorded, and we're going to archive it to our YouTube station. It usually takes a couple of days, so please be patient with us. But with that, I want to thank everybody again, and we'll see you on Thursday. Thanks.